I'm the short one. I would like to say on behalf of the committee that put the conference together, I would just like to say thank you for coming here today because I have had such fun and I like seeing all of you in person and getting to meet you. There's so many of you. I still wish I had time to meet today. But seeing familiar faces for me has just been the best part of all of this. So, how many of you out there have trouble with your neighbors? Right? And online, I'm sure. We're going to try to solve some of that today with our next speaker. There's a stereotype out there that native plants are messy and disorganized spaces. Well, Toshi Yano is a leader in horticulture and in the native plant movement. And he is here and he's going to tell you today in his presentation how to create exuberant spaces that are going to keep your homeowners associations happy. It's called Cues to Care, and everybody's going to walk away happy at the end of this presentation. Toshi Yano is the director of the Perfect Earth Project. If you don't know about it, please look it up. They are doing incredible work. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to engaging and inspiring individuals to adopt a toxic-free, nature-based, climate-responsible land care management practices. So without further ado, I am just going to give this microphone over to Toshi. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Kim. I don't think I'm going to live up to the hype. I'm just going to, if I could make you all happy, I would probably have a different job. Before I start, I want to thank you, Kim, again, and thank you to the Native Plant Society of New Jersey for this day, and also for reintroducing me to someone I hadn't seen in 34 years here, Sarah Paulson. I knew her as Sarah Perlman. She also put together this amazing guide, the new NPSNJ Native Plant School Guide, and she's part of the Essex County chapter. And so it's really nice to reconnect with Sarah after all this time. Let's see, I have to organize myself just a little bit here. Okay. So my name is Toshi, and I'm the director of Perfect Earth Project. It's a nonprofit organization founded by a woman named Edwina Von Gall, a landscape designer, to promote toxic-free, nature-based land management practices in our design landscapes. I won't be talking too much about my day job today, but more about the context in which I came to the work and the way that context frames the work I'm doing, which is, I think, hopefully the work that we're all doing, which is the design and care of ecological landscapes. I'm going to keep using that word frame today because when I met with Kim and Cassis and Randy and the speaker selection committee to discuss presenting here, they asked whether I could speak about cues to care, which is really all about framing. And as a professional gardener, which was my background before moving to nonprofit work, I always loved to produce displays which were about as wild and woolly as possible, abundant, exuberant, vibrant, but clearly intentional, and communicating that intentionality is all about framing it correctly. So I said, well, sure, I think I can talk about cues to care, about framing. And one thing I remembered about the term cues to care is that there's a woman who's been using that term and coined the term, and she's been talking about them for decades. Her name's Joan Iverson Nassauer. She invented the term, and so I went to the source. And I think all of you should. She wrote 3 seminal papers starting in the late 80s and through the 90s to understand what she means by cues to care. So I'm going to start with an epigraph, which I always love as a framing device that helps set the tone a little bit. And it's from her seminal article, Messy Ecosystems, Orderly Frames. And you heard Sarah earlier use those terms herself. She says, cues to care make the novel familiar and associate ecosystems that may look messy with unmistakable indications that the landscape is part of a larger intended pattern. And she says so much more, and I recommend reading her if you haven't, because so much of the work that Doug and Homegrown National Park and all the American meadow folks and the new perennialists in Europe, so much of their work is explicitly based on her writing. So I think this is a great place to start. But also, like a messy novel, I have a second epigraph because I want to talk about what we're framing as well. So Neusauer is focused on the frames and the design, and that's super important, and about using the frames to communicate intent. But in this talk, I also want to talk about not just the cues, but the care itself, and also talk a bit about how care is its own kind of frame, as expressed here so beautifully by John Sayles, who was the head of gardens at the UK's National Trust. And he says the term maintenance suggests routine static procedures like dusting. But in a garden, every repeated operation has a cumulative effect. Even how you cut the lawn, rake paths, mend fences, or repair buildings. Everything you do in a garden contributes to and is design. And as a gardener and a maintenance professional myself, that has a real resonance for me. And so this talk is about cues to care, but also care, and how they both frame the work we're doing. So this picture you saw earlier, this is from Wethersfield Estate and Garden in New York's Hudson Valley, where I was the director of horticulture for about 4 years before moving to Perfect Earth. And I think it offers a pretty nice visual representation of what I'm going to be talking about today. Namely, how our approach to designing and maintaining gardens are in a period of real transition, and also how that transition can be framed. And here that framing is happening pretty literally. On the left side of the picture, you see a limestone stair and balustrade and a pair of limestone obelisks, framing a set of axes defined by formal hedging and topiary. On the right side of the picture, a less formal, more exuberant planting of native-ish sweet bay magnolia, mountain rose bay, hay-scented cinnamon and sensitive ferns, and blue wood aster. Just past this little vignette, an obscuring mist, or maybe more threateningly, wildfire smoke, which speaks to the very uncertain future which we're all hurtling towards, and which ultimately frames our work and makes it more important now than ever. And I said native-ish, and I'm sure all of you in the room sniffed out what I meant. This is Dutchess County, New York, where the ferns and the aster are native, but the magnolia and the rhododendron are not. And so I'm just going to say before moving on, because of who you all are, that I'm definitely a native plant enthusiast, a lover of local ecotypes, all that great stuff, but I'm not a purist strictly, and you're going to see a lot of pictures of my work in the past, which is going to show you that. So just, I was trained with horticultural plants and planted and cared for many non-native plants over the years, and so, you know, I recognize the value of those plants and even the ecological value, as Doug Tallamy does too, and of non-native species. So even though my home property is close to 100% native, maybe 90% native and 10% non-native, if you took a trip into my kitchen and you opened my refrigerator, you'd probably find the inverse of that, if not more non-native plants there, which is to say we probably all value non-native plants and animals very highly, as long as they're within the frame of that agricultural landscape or a grocery store or the farmer's market. And just in terms of biodiversity loss, which Marielle talked about earlier, our global agricultural practices are probably the #1 driving force of biodiversity loss. And so what we're doing here is super important. But you know, she talked a lot about political will and motive, and I think that's even more important. She's right. But going back in and focusing again, hopefully I haven't alienated everyone before even starting. And if I have, I'm going to put up a picture of a young 6-year-old version of myself, very defenseless child with his pussy cat named Pussy Woo. This was me, 6 years old in Washington, D.C., sadly in front of some impatiens, non-native impatiens, but what did my parents know, right? So this was my first backyard in Washington, D.C. I was born in New York and moved to Japan before coming back to the States when I was 5. And that was my cat, as I mentioned, Pussy Woo, who lived with his family under our steps until he decided to move into our house. And I think for children, being outside means blurred boundaries. You know, there are cats in yards, roly-polies under stones, woolly bears and leaves, and you hear rustling and birdsong. And back then in DC, even in the city, we had fireflies, which would light up the nighttime sky. And there's life everywhere, and it's teeming, and it's magical. And part of what I want to ask today is, can we learn to manage our landscapes with that kind of magic in mind? And maybe more importantly, can we communicate that magic to those neighbors that we all have problems with, and to the world? And I think we can, but I do think we have to know how to frame it. So another bit of biography. My parents split when I was 10, and my summers were spent in Japan for the next 4 years with my Japanese father. And he would take his vacation with me every year, always to important cultural sites. So this is me at Himeji Castle. And the point of this isn't to show off my cool E.T. Lives t-shirt, but to point out the wooden fences, the gravel paths, the trimmed grass, the whitewashed walls, all the stuff Sales talked about in that second quote earlier, all framing this amazing, exuberant woodland, which looks ready to take over the castle grounds, but we know that it isn't. It's not Macbeth, it's not Birnham Wood, because those cues to care tell us that that's intentional, and that ecology has a place even in this symbol of military might. Every other year, we went to Kyoto. My dad loves the gardens there, and I grew too as well. For our current purpose, what strikes me is that gardens like Ryoanji here were maintained by monks over the course of centuries using traditional hand tools, famously rakes, to create those lines and intricate patterns in stone and sand. And for me as a gardener, these are cues to care too. And the evidence of them is actually visible. They're everywhere, but particularly in the raked lines there, which isn't something you can produce with a leaf blower. And which communicates to us that it's not just a gravel courtyard where you can walk, but it's a work of art, and you can't walk there. And ecology can be a work of art too, and is obviously already a kind of work of art. Next is the Silver Pavilion, Ginkakuji, again, maintained by hand for centuries. The trees, the result of decades and centuries of meticulous hand pruning. And if you know how to read this landscape, you can see the care in that landscape. When I started high school, my father moved to London, a couple blocks from Hyde Park, and he was at the Marble Arch Tube Station, which would be the back left corner of the park in this picture. And he lived in a little mews apartment with my stepmother. And I'd walk that park almost every day as I explored the city. Obviously a much different landscape than the Japanese ones. Sweeping turf fields, stands of trees, perennial gardens, and a rose garden too, if I remember it correctly. So a kind of modified, picturesque landscape. When I was there, these weren't maintained with sheep or other pasturing animals as that kind of landscape would have been when it was first sort of created, when Capability Brown sort of swept the English countryside with this kind of landscape. But they were maintained with gas-powered mowers and pesticides. Now the City of London parks are managed according to an international landscape sustainability standard called ISO 14001, which sounds maybe frighteningly bureaucratic, but is a little like the NOFA land care standards, and is much better than anything we have here in the States. I moved to New York to study philosophy in 1991, and I lived on St. Mark's Place, about a half a block from Tompkins Square Park, which is another modified, picturesque landscape. The English influence pretty clear here in Mariel's favorite daffodils blooming. I have these photos in my deck to show that our design and management approaches are everywhere in landscape, and they really frame the way we see plant life and thus nature itself, and that those approaches are sometimes hidden, sometimes not, sometimes driven by two-stroke engines so loud you wish they were hidden, influencing our lives and the way we think about nature, such that if you live in a dense city, as I did for most of my life, trees seem like unconnected individual things. But what's common about all these photos is that they're all systems of care, recognized commonly as such. They're ways of framing landscape that people understand and acknowledge and are traditional and non-native, yes, but what Neusauer argues is that they're useful. If we in this room are going to be successful, they can function as cues to folks who are a little bit more hostile towards what we're doing. And so she calls them sometimes boundary elements because they sort of are frame or mediate what's behind them and what people are looking at from outside of them. And so if we can use these kinds of, the lawn as a mediating element and trim it and do all those nice things, we can be more successful with our endeavors. So I'm going to fast forward past 30 years of my life, a lot of wandering involved. But here I've started a family. I've moved out of New York City to the town of Cold Spring, population 7,500. The first time in my life I'd lived outside of any city. And I was lucky enough to be a stay-at-home father. And while my wife worked in the city, my daughter Sachi and I explored. And Cold Spring is great. If you haven't been, it's bounded on all sides by state parks. And it was fantastic, connecting to nature and green spaces and seeing it all through her eyes, as she and I both experienced it for the first time. I remember the first summer there, a brood of cicadas sort of swept through town, and she was crazy about them. And she'd collect handful after handful and throw them to our chickens, who would devour them, who were then devoured by the foxes. So native sometimes wins, everybody. Here she is teaching me about spittlebugs, which I'd never seen before. There wasn't a ton happening culturally in Cold Spring, but we did find one place we both love visiting regularly. So this is Stonecrop Gardens. It's a non-native landscape, as you can see. This is Frank and Anne Cabot's country home, and the Cabots are best known for their gardens at Quatre-Vents, outside of Quebec, and for founding the Garden Conservancy, with whom Perfect Earth works on their nibbled leaf program, which I encourage you all to learn about on the Garden Conservancy's website. I remember seeing this stone bridge for the first time and wondering how it had gotten to Cold Spring, because to me it was a cue and one that pointed to East Asia. And it frames the pond as well, and it lets us see the landscape in a very different way than if that bridge weren't there. Anyway, my daughter and I would go at least once a week during Stonecrop's open season. But as much as I enjoyed spending time in nature and in Stonecrop, it couldn't last forever. My wife reasonably asked me to pick up my share of the workload so she could spend time with our daughter, and I did. And I worked as a loading supervisor at a UPS warehouse, expelled momentarily from my personal Eden. But inspired by Stonecrop and with a nice educational benefit courtesy of UPS, I went back to school. And so this is Bronx Community College, where I got my ornamental horticulture degree. And I loved this campus, this Palladian building complex here. And though the landscape is not a Palladian landscape, Palladio worked during the Italian Renaissance. This is, again, that picturesque landscape that the English it's kind of its own invasive species, right? It's kind of a default in our parks, throughout the West. And it's so prevalent that Neusauer says this landscape, the picturesque, is the one that most people in this country associate with nature. And it's not nature. Anyway, the great thing about the Bronx Community College program is that all the horticulture classes are at the New York Botanic Garden. And so I learned about plant science from the botanists on staff and horticulture practices and grounds management from the lifers who worked on staff, some for more than 50 years. And obviously this is a horticultural display here with lots of non-natives. Again, those dreaded daffodils and some tulips in there, I think, as well. But what I kind of want to keep making clear here is that these plantings, these horticultural displays, they're what Neusauer says basically, they're frames to show that what we do isn't there are ways of thinking about landscape that say to our neighbors, this isn't some crazy derelict space. These are, we've put these plants next to one another very intentionally. And obviously all of us in this room, we, do the same thing, but maybe with a different intention. But these design cues are really important to communicate their work. So while I was working at UPS and going to school, I also got my dream job. So this is the conservatory at Stonecrop Gardens, and I'd impressed the director there with my many visits and my well-behaved daughter. And when that's true, because she's a very strict executive director and doesn't like children very much. One of the interns, when she found out that I was studying, said I should try my hand at Stonecrop. And I'm glad that she did, because if I hadn't gotten the courage to do it, I probably wouldn't be on stage here today. But that intern is this woman named Emily Dietrich, who's now the director of horticulture at Cornell Botanic Gardens, who's done so much important work Cornell on Northeast native lawn experiments, which maybe you all know about, and I'll show a picture a bit later. But they're working with the Northeast Native Seed Network and the Ecological Health Alliance to make that seed available and native lawn marketable, which would be an amazing thing considering how much of our acreage in this country is dedicated to non-native lawn. At Stonecrop, we were trained in the best of traditional British horticultural techniques. And for, anyway, reasons too numerous to get into here, at this point in my life, my wife and I divorced. And so I moved into an apartment at the garden and started to throw myself bodily into my new life, my new horticultural life. And so I learned about plant and color combinations in the Gertrude Jekyll-inspired inner sanctum shown here. I learned about proper staking, RHS double knots, double digging, proper balance when stepping into and out of a garden bed. All the care that's required to make a garden look good to other people and to the public. And I took great pride in knowing these things, knowing about all sorts of plants, their botanical names, and the ways we take care of them. And I was put in charge of the maintenance of the British-style woodland garden. I developed a real love here, actually, of native woodland plants. So particularly the spring ephemerals, trillium, ladies' slippers, Virginia bluebells, here Spanish bluebells too, so not entirely native, obviously. But in front of those, one of my very favorite plants, the Dutchman's breeches, or Dicentra cucularia. There's a massive patch a couple 100 feet from my house that I love to go see in the spring at the site of an old mill, a former industrial site, which shows us, I think, that there's still hope yet, you know, in these post-industrial spaces. In fact, some of the most interesting novel ecological communities sort of pop up at these abandoned industrial sites, the gray and the brown fields. The old High Line in New York, which inspired the new High Line. And we see so many designers now taking their cues from those sites. And we can too, because they're seeing native plants that thrive in disturbed areas and saying, hey, we can use those and maybe change the way people see and frame landscape. And I'll, jumping ahead of myself a little bit, because I'll talk about those in a little bit. But next, I moved on to work at a private estate, lured, frankly, by the better pay. And again, you're seeing a lot of non-native landscapes here, and I know it, and I apologize. But because of my work in Stoneland's woodland garden, I was given charge of this Japanese maple garden, which was 25 acres or so of over 300 Japanese maple cultivars, and a large collection of rare Asian woodland perennials. And maybe you're cringing, and you're saying, what does any of this have to do with us at the Native Plant Society of New Jersey? But I was asked to speak about cues to care and about framing and, frankly, making things look good to people who expect lawns and picturesque landscapes and straight lines of annuals. And we have to know how to communicate to these folks if we're going to have success with native plants. So what is a cue here? Well, there are two. One is this understanding of foliage, both the color and the texture. The designer of this garden obviously knew their maple cultivars and how they would look to one another, how they would look next to one another in October. And we can do this with native plants too. Our northeastern shrubs and trees have some of the best color in the world. They're taken to other countries because they have such great color. And if you can find straight species of ironwood, of Carpinus carolinianus, you might even be able to do it with just that straight species because they're so variable. You could have a bunch of them next to one another and they could do something pretty similar to this. The other cue here is the stone steps, which we regularly swept. And so that's maybe a more subtle hint that someone here cares. So I grew in my horticultural career here, as my own instincts for care were noted by my supervisors. I became the horticulture manager, and I was responsible for the plant health for the 80-acre estate. So my approach was organic. I'd been inspired by the folks at the New York Botanic Garden to use beneficial insects, biological controls, and products and processes that encourage plant health without the use of synthetic chemicals. I wasn't required to be organic, but I'd always felt anxious putting on Tyvek suits and respirators, as I'm sure any of you would, and I was happy to be using many fewer chemicals. And I think organic was better than what had been done before there, but just before going too far, I don't think it's good enough. I'm getting ahead of myself again, though. So I also got to hone my own design chops at the ruins. I told you I was going to show you a lot of non-native plants. This ruin was the one-time home of American author Theodore Dreiser, who wrote the novel that became the movie, A Place in the Sun. which is a great movie if you haven't seen it. It's Elizabeth Taylor, Montgomery Clift, and Shelley Winters. It's a really dark, dark movie, but great. And because of that link, I called this garden a place in part sun. It's an actual ruin here. And while you might, be upset about the plant selection, which is fair, you can't say that it looks derelict, even though it's a ruin. One thing that's useful here is color. Neusauer talks about flowering as a cue. If things are popping, we know there's something intentional happening, or at least beautiful. And we know here that we should be planting so that there should always be 3 sources of food or flowering going on for pollinators at any time during their life cycle. So you're gonna have to excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold. So the idea here is to plant more flowers. This is a little later in the spring. Allium, foxgloves, roses. The sheer abundance of selected plants here, this is a nice management cue, outcompeted the weeds, which is helpful as it cuts down on labor. And most of the seedlings that came up were previous year's hardy annuals, which self-sowed. And this is designed for maintenance and maintenance for design. And it's the sales idea that we mentioned earlier. And there are more subtle cues here too. I approached the planting using a design philosophy I'd heard described by Cassian Schmidt, who maybe you've heard of, the sadly former director of Hermannshof in Germany, one of the originators of the new perennialist movement, which has affected us so much here in the States. He taught a class at NYBG that involved using specific percentages of what he called structural plants, companion plants, and ground layer plants in a kind of matrix. And his claim is that if you select the correct percentages of those plants, it's almost instinctively pleasing to the eye, to the human eye. So again, knowing how to frame plant selection is really important. His idea, just to do a quick aside, is that if you plant structural plants, you can mix them up however you want to, but if like 20% of them are big and tall, and then you plant a bunch of companion plants, flowering plants around them, and then have a ground layer plant, you have this great plant system where the weeds are being suppressed by the ground layer plants. You have these beautiful structural plants blooming, and then all these companion plants sort of popping off at different times through the year. And he showed us in that class just a bunch of different approaches to that and how he took that idea from nature, and it's an effective thing. Even if you don't like the plants in the palette, it can be effective way to frame those plants. And you can obviously use native plants to do the same thing. Here's some native plants. We had a Larry Wiener meadow at the estate, which was actually the trickiest, most labor-intensive part of the estate to manage. So please don't let anyone tell you that meadows are easy. They're not. They're basically huge perennial beds that require constant vigilance and often synthetic chemicals to be successful. And I say this, and a lot of different meadow makers believe in the use of synthetic chemicals as a sort of eraser of plant life before installing or seeding plants. But it's important to realize that glyphosate especially is something that Dow and Monsanto and all those folks, it's their product. And so when we use it, we're giving money to these massive agrochemical corporations. They're, if we looked at what they were doing everywhere else in the world, we would say we don't support them. But we have native plant enthusiasts supporting, that kind of chemical production, and it feels a little bit strange sometimes, to say the least. So I did have to paint mugwort with, it wasn't glyphosate, it was stinger, which is another herbicide, which is just as bad. But so I say all that to say that I've used them, I've done it, I don't support it. That kind of work falls on the folks who are probably earning the least amount of money at a space, and asking people to do that. We know at this point, probable carcinogens, they affect neurological development, all that good stuff. So let me step back off of my podium. I'll stay here, but to finish. But so anyway, between NYBG, Stonecrop, and my work here, I felt that I was learning and practicing and working in every kind of sort of Northeast horticulture vernacular, from highly traditional British flower gardens to cutting-edge meadow management. This is the main house at Wethersfield, which was the next stop in my personal garden journey. It was built by its owner, Chauncey Stillman, at the height of the Great Depression, and so great care was taken not to overwhelm the visitor with too much immediate ostentation and ornament. At its face, it looks maybe like a big old Georgian that you might find in an old suburb. And our lesson here is what formal framing can do for our gardens and landscapes. Though the house was semi-modest, the ambition wasn't. The house and gardens sit at the highest point of what was at its peak a 1,200-acre property, a property that Stillman had used to advance new methods of conservation agriculture in the wake of the Dust Bowl, that early taste of what human-driven ecological catastrophe could look like. An example of the chaos bad land management can wreak. In his response to the Dust Bowl, Stillman had hired a farm manager from Kansas, started the Dutchess County Soil and Water Conservation District, introduced contour farming to the Hudson Valley, was an early adopter of biodynamic farming, initiated crop rotation, corralled fens in several places to create retention ponds to capture runoff, which was guided down drainage channels he created by adjusting the topography of the landscape. He stocked those ponds with native fish and waterfowl, lined those ponds with irrigation to provide water to crops in times of drought, had reforested almost 400 acres in conjunction with the New York State Department of Conservation, and more. He reintroduced skunks to Dutchess County. So this is where I kind of began to develop a conservation approach to horticulture, guided by the history of this place. And to give you a sense of it, this is the house in the early 1940s, not long after completion. In their earliest iteration, the gardens here were arts and crafts inspired. Garden rooms as adjuncts to the house, extending interiors out into the landscape, ornamenting them with herbaceous borders, gentle water features, leaded urns, marble statuary. Over time, the gardens became more ambitious. Stillman hired a landscape architect named Evelyn Poehler, who'd continue working on the estate for 40 years. This was her first big project in the early 1950s, a pool for the family. And in the back, you can see a marvelous arborvitae alley. So some native plants here used strangely, maybe, to some of us in this room. Poehler, excitingly, was a big proponent of native, or as we saw earlier, native-ish plants, and she used them wherever she could. That alley, at its peak, reached a height of 28 feet before weather and pest damage, a regular occurrence in this garden as it's aged, required its replanting in 2015. Now, would I plant a hedge of eastern white cedar and clip it like this? No, it's a lot of work, and it's a monoculture, which we'll talk about more, but it's fascinating work for a gardener, and there's a lot of interesting problem solving involved. And if you want to see native plants framed in ways that will impress your neighbors, you could do worse than starting with something like this. Wethersfield is a take on the Renaissance garden, complete with a bosco, or a woodland, with psychosexual reframings of Dante and Virgil, laid out in a statuary program that includes a personal inferno, purgatorio, paradiso, and an Elysian fields. And I love that about it, but it's also a nightmare to maintain organically, with its thousands of, again, monocultural feet of yew and other woody plants clipped annually, a much more intensive approach to woody plant management than the Japanese approach we saw earlier. Though obviously cared for, this garden required so many inputs: labor, money, energy, and eventually, sadly, synthetic pesticides, which I will talk about again in short order. Here's something kind of neat for you all. A line of dwarf dog hobble, or Leucothea fontanesiana, another native-ish plant, that I decided to use formally. This replaced a double line of hosta, which had itself replaced the dwarf viburnum opulus that had been ravaged by a viburnum leaf beetle. Another giant risk with any monocultures is obviously that if the wrong insects come, they can wipe out the whole planting. Here, copper beech overhangs a terrace. Below, you can see columnar weeping beeches trained and pruned annually. The only ones I've ever seen in the world that look like that. In Dutchess County, far out of their native habitat, these European beeches are more of a potent symbol of wealth than a solid plant selection. And that I found a number of restricted pesticides in the chemical closet when I started made a kind of sense, despite the long conservation history here. But look at those rhododendron catabianths pop, a mix of native and non-native azaleas and those hay-scented cinnamon and sensitive ferns. Another thing New Sauer calls a cue to care is a clean edge, which we had a ton of. And you can see they're effective, but I like them even more when the plants would overgrow those edges just a little bit so that you could see that the plants were doing what they wanted to do, but the line was there showing a human hand. Here's that same space from a different perspective. Hostas bordering the lawn, which were planted by my predecessor when another low hedge of dwarf viburnum had been ravaged by that viburnum leaf beetle. They'll be replaced later this year by a selection of dwarf summer sweet, Clethra alnifolia, called Tom's Compact, which I think was found right around here somewhere. I think it's a selection from the pine barrens. Anyway, we selected that after a 3-year trial of native shrubs to determine what we would use. Let's see. You may have noticed, again, what I call an adaptive approach to Renaissance garden here. So instead of boxwood, Italian cypress, and hollyoaks, Stillman and Polar chose yew, arborvitae, beeches, pin oaks, and honey locusts. That they did their best to evoke Italy in what was, when they started, a Zone 4B location, now a 5B location, and they often use native plants to do it. But here are some of the tricky realities of that kind of planting. Black vine weevil appearing on yews was a sign that something was amiss, and these can be treated with beneficial nematodes, and that's what we did, I think successfully. But one thing I've recently learned about beneficial nematodes is that they're basically the toughest nematodes they can keep on the shelf for the longest period of time, which means that they're extra aggressive. And soil is its own ecology, as we all know, its own biome. And so when we use nematodes off the shelf, we're altering the soil ecology in ways that we're not even aware of. And so we might be getting rid of grubs and black vine weevils, but we're also outcompeting the nematodes that are in there, which we could, if we took the time, also propagate and use in our lawns. Just something to think about if you're interested in using them for pest control. And really, what I also want to point out here is that no life form is a pest per se, only in a given context. What they are is indicators, I think, signs of out-of-balance ecologies. And those ecologies, those out-of-balance ecologies, are brought out of balance, not by the pests, but by the people who introduced them, and have been introduced, since the 15th century. So anyway, this is the spongy moth, formerly known as the gypsy moth. They arrived at Wethersfield about 2 years ago, and we treated them with BT, which is a bacteria which home gardeners spray on the tomatoes. It's organic, but we were spraying landscape trees, which include all the ones that Sarah was talking about earlier, the oaks, birches, witch hazels, cherries, which are really important keystone species that give life to tens of thousands of other important moths and butterflies, which feed the birds. And BT, despite being organic, is indiscriminate. Any caterpillar will succumb. So it's safe to say that time and natural processes are often better treatments than any spray. And in fact, there's a naturally occurring fungus that would normally control spongy moth populations. But because of climate change and drought, we've been in drought so regularly that the fungus had temporarily lost its hold. So again, it's a system, an ecology that's out of balance. And though we want healthy plants, we want even more healthier ecologies. So it's tricky to balance those things, especially in a public garden where aesthetics are sort of the primary concern. This is something you can't treat organically, and it's called the ambrosia beetle. 2021 was one of our wettest summers on record, following a couple drought years, though probably not as bad as 2023. And it was, you saw all those pictures of the European beaches. Those trees hate having wet feet, and they have to have sent out their stress signals because in 2022, our arborists found the tiny holes these creatures put in the trunks of their favorite trees. And when they do that, they cut channels up and down the trunks. They leave a fungal residue behind, which clogs the vasculature of their hosts. And you saw the beeches, the massive copper beeches, the singular weeping beech topiaries, and how they are important they were to the garden's structure, its aesthetic. So as soon as he saw the ambrosia beetle holes, our arborist suited up, and he sprayed permethrin, which is a relatively, that's such a tricky word, right? Relatively benign synthetic pyrethroid, harmless to people for the most part, but toxic to all insect and invertebrate life. And it's persistent in the landscape. It's supposed to remain effective for 30 to 90 days. I'd like to add that permethrin is the main ingredient in most of the natural tick sprays that people use on their lawns. And repeat that it's toxic to all insect and invertebrate life for 30 to 90 days. So I always tell people when they're going outside, spray yourself if you must, but don't spray your lawn. This is a pleached beach tunnel. It's a really special, historic, living artifact. There are not very many pleached woody structures in this country. It was my favorite place in the garden, and I say was because this was the aftermath of the ambrosia beetle. So the permethrin that we sprayed wasn't even successful, really. Or it was, it limited the damage, but the beetle knocked out probably a third of the beech trees on the property, including in that tunnel. And at this point, beyond being non-native, it's irresponsible to plant beeches because they're just under too much disease pressure. They have root funguses, bark funguses, they have the ambrosia beetle, and if you go out into the woods, if you have stands of beech around here, you know that there's a beech leaf disease that's wiping out beech stands across the Midwest, in the Northeast, down to the Mid-Atlantic. So you have to use chemicals, basically, if you plant beech now just to keep it alive. We replanted with native ironwood, Carpinus caroliniana, which I talked a little bit about before. Not a cultivar, but the straight species. Much more tolerant of both wet and dry, sun and shade. Really beautiful color in the fall. The bark, as you probably all know, amazing, twisted, smooth bark. And I'm hopeful that in 20 or 30, maybe it'll take 50 years, this will be even more spectacular than what it replaced. And it's still a monoculture, which is tricky, but the property's on the National Register of Historic Places. Part of working in a place like that is you have to maintain that aesthetic. You have to have a fairly conservative approach to change. So I'm hopeful, but the stresses of the past years have made me question kind of the practices of horticultural care generally. I don't think as managers, land managers, conservation managers, I don't think we're prepared for what's coming down the pipe. We don't have the tools necessarily. And too often in our landscapes, a design aesthetic, or more crassly, our contractors' business models embedded in algorithms and the software that they use to make as much money as possible are determining the practices that we use in our home landscapes. This is my daughter a couple years ago volunteering to muck out the goldfish pool to her right or to our right. And if our design concerns were sort of, in the previous century, were about color palettes, plant combinations, textures, the push and pull of formality and wildness, hardscape and plant matter, all those cues to care that I've been talking about and sort of promoting, I think our concerns this century are very different. We're responding, sadly, to circumstances that are undermining our ability to garden at all. Crises in biodiversity, human health and well-being, and climate change, much of it caused by land use change, as I mentioned earlier, which is to say by land care practices writ large. Our concerns now include our children, and they include black-capped chickadees, and bobolinks, grosbeaks, orioles, and warblers, once so common, but whose numbers are in rapid decline, our native bees and other pollinators, even our food web itself. You got to ask how viable a management practice this is, given the triple crisis of human health, biodiversity, and climate change. And this, look how much protection this guy needs. Ear protection, eye protection, gloves to mitigate the constant vibrations, air, noise, and particle pollution being emitted just to remove the leaves, which could actually feed that grass if he decided to use mulch mower instead of a blower. And who are we asking to carry the weight of those practices? The answer is generally workers from marginalized communities on whom so much environmental stress already falls. And also our children, who will inherit the unknown effects of these practices. So our goal at Perfect Earth Project is to improve our land care practices. Doug and Homegrown have done so much to introduce native plants, and folks like you in this room have done so much to introduce the importance and the value of native plants, but we think there's a value in management practices as well. And so this is just a basic, ultra basic framework for how we're thinking of our core practices, which currently number around 100, and have been vetted by conservationists, ecologists, land managers, horticulturalists, basically maximize biodiversity, minimize harm. On the yellow bit, it's mostly habitat, and not just habitat for the macrofauna, but for the soil as well. Minimize harm. This is really where the management practices come into play. Understand your land. Know where you are in your ecoregion. Know what your soil geology is. Know what your threatened and endangered species are. Know where your watershed is. Know where your important things are. Be toxic free. Please banish pesticides and synthetic fertilizers from your landscape. It's a health concern, and it's something that will resolve itself probably naturally if you let it be. Stop the chop. People over prune. You saw that I have experienced over pruning things. Every cut is a wound. Every wound sends a stress signal out. If you have topiary, you probably have to do some pest management because those plants do attract pests, so-called pests, when they're cut back so regularly and so often. Close the loop. Keep the biomass on your property as you can. Keep dead trees up if you can, if they're not a safety hazard. Reuse all the dead branches that come down, create habitat piles. Keep everything on your property. Try to keep water on your property as much as possible. We've seen the damage that storms have done. I know it's getting trickier and trickier, but anytime it runs off, we're creating eutrophication crises in freshwater ponds and in oceans. So everything we can do to keep water in our land on your home, please try to do that. Go electric if you must. Use power tools, use electric ones. Ideally use hand pruners and rakes the way the Japanese did. Water only when needed. I know we've been in drought semi-frequently recently. Most plants, even in drought, just need an inch of water every couple of weeks. When you do water deeply so that they don't need to keep, so that they're not growing all their roots up at the top. And obviously limit artificial lighting. We heard Sarah talk about that. Thankfully, we have great partners in our work. Strategic partners like the Garden Conservancy, Forest for All New York City, leaders of urban horticulture in New York City, the Rodale Institute, the Peconic Land Trust in Long Island. Great strategic partners that are helping us consider and spread the word, but also public landscape partners. So we partner with folks in public landscapes so that we can promote their work, the great work that they're doing, and learn from them, and also program with them. So this is Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, reducing difficult to manage turf grass on steep slopes and replacing them with native meadow. And they're doing something great there with the yellow, like that, another cue to care. If there were fewer plants blooming at this time, or they were a jumble, you might say, oh, that's just wild and loose, but they're all yellow plants and it looks amazing. The structures are helpful too. They're cleaned and maintained. This is the Pete Adolph Garden at the Battery Conservancy at the southern tip of Manhattan. This is a landscape that forced 4 pesticides over 20 years ago. They were the innovators in New York City. Now all the New York City parks have to go through an application process to even get their hands on pesticides. So excellent work by the Battery. This is Stoneleigh Gardens near Villanova outside of Philadelphia. It's a fantastic native plant garden. Doing work with formal structures. The last time I was there, I saw that they were leaving standing dead trees, as we all know from Doug's work, but so many conservationists. Those snags are important wildlife habitat, not just for the birds and the insects, but the trees themselves are holobionts, which is a word I recently learned, but they have really important funguses and bacteria living in them, and only in these old trees. And so they have a whole system of life inside them that's irreplaceable. So really important to keep those old dead trees around if you can. And it takes some courage for public gardeners to embrace this kind of practice, and also for us. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the courage that we're going to need, even if we do use cues to care. At Chanticleer Garden in Philadelphia, everyone loves this gravel garden. It's very picturesque. But I loved most recently seeing this habitat pile. You can see they're just on the left there along a path, not too far from a cut flower garden. I've made one myself at my home garden recently, and they're great for insects and birds and other mammals and other animals and mammals. And it's a very small way to support your local food web. If you have neighbors, you can put that in your backyard who are going to get mad at that. But I think, another way of maintaining biomass. Mount Cuba, we all know and love, a beautiful native plant garden in Delaware. The spring there is just incredible. And another picture from Mount Cuba. This kind of ecologically sensitive work is being done internationally too. Nigel Dunnett does amazing public work in the United Kingdom, but I love his home garden. He's created these amazing low walls of cut branches from dead trees to create habitat, and they just last for years, and he keeps adding to them, so it's like a constant living dead wall. And Great Dixter, which this is a little bit maybe controversial. Uh, it's UK, so their plant palette is different. They don't have as many native plants as we do here. But they use a ton of non-native plants, but this is apparently one of the most biodiverse places in the United Kingdom. And it's in part because of the input that they put into it. It's all hand dug. They do annual turnovers every, when I say annuals, I mean the annual plants. They have like a spring planting, a summer planting. And when they do that, the dirt gets turned. And so they talk about all the birds that follow them around everywhere they go. Apparently birds know to follow gardeners when they're outside because they kick up the worms. They also have really rare bats and insects there, and it's probably because they're gardening. Anyway, those are the kinds of gardens I love, those wild, exuberant gardens. But even if this is your ideal, a nice lawn and some specimen trees, there's a healthier, more ecologically sensitive way to do it. This is the kind of lawn that requires 2,4-D usually for weed control. And if that's the case, that toddler shouldn't even be near the lawn. 2,4-D does have neurological effects on growing children and pets, if any of you have pets. Another reason not to use it. And this is Cornell's lawn experiment that I mentioned earlier. It's a combination of native grasses and low native perennials that they only mow once a year. And they could mow it more often, but it looks pretty great to me. So back to the beginning, while we still look at and think about landscapes with 19th or 20th century frames, that fog or wildflower smoke, whichever it is beginning to engulf us. And our traditional practices are failing. The plants we love and thought we knew how to grow are failing. Wethersfield, steeped in conservation history, was an individual concern, but its owner hoped its lessons could be shared with others. While it's going through a difficult moment, as I showed you, the gardeners there are dedicated to its transformation and its resilience. And I hope that Wethersfield and Chanticleer and Stoneleigh and Dixter and the Battery and Mount Cuba will all function as kinds of beacons. As designers, as gardeners, as land managers and land care professionals, we create and tend to the spaces where people and nature meet. We tend to ecologies. The more we think about ourselves as active agents, as keystone species ourselves, which was something I heard an indigenous woman say, I think that's such a great idea that people are keystone species. We can generate and maintain biodiverse habitats, connect ourselves to other people doing the same. And the more we do that, I think the better our gardens are going to stand up and the better our landscapes are going to stand up and be connected. So last pictures. This is my own home garden. I did tell you that I love native plants, and you can see them here. I didn't just plant aliens or invasives or whatever you want to call them. I don't care about cues to care, but I'm lucky because I'm at the top of a hill. My property's at the top of the hill, so I don't have to worry about my neighbors who do have nice lawns and all that kind of stuff. This is what used to be a lawn on my property. It's anemone canadensis, anemone virginiana, birch trees, river birch, and I think there's some itea in there as well, and I'm just blanking on one, of course, because I always do. What's that? There's no witch hazel there. I love witch hazel though. That's what I'm blanking on. There you go, thank you. It's on my own property, of course I forget it. It's Fothergilla. So, it's messy and native and woolly, and there's hardly a cue to care in sight. That's how I love to garden, or not garden. Ungarden is something I heard recently. But I think those cues to care are really important. I think for a lot of us who can't garden this way, if you're not lucky enough to live at the top of your own little hill, you can do things, people talk about the classic ones, just mowing a strip of your wild and woolly landscape to show that someone's caring for it. Using flowers so that things are in bloom regularly throughout the year is not just a great way to tell your neighbors that you're caring for it, but it's a great way to feed your pollinators as well. Taking cuts of your flowers as they're going and handing them to your critical neighbors is another nice way. It's a great cue to care. That's a cue to care, and I think it's a nice way, inviting people over if you've mowed a square in your lawn and you have a space for your barbecue or something like that. Inviting people over and having them in, that's another cue to care. I think community cues to care are even more valuable in some ways than design cues to care, which is what Nusauer was talking so much about. I think those are really important. I think super effective. But I think those kinds of movements toward community are much more important ultimately than something that people see. If you can have them feel what you feel, you're going to be much more effective, I think, in the work that you're trying to do. So I've gone on longer than I wanted to, as I always do. If you're interested in this kind of work, if you want to apply it at home, we have a book for sale today. It's called Nature-Based Gardening. It's a primer on closed-loop, toxic-free, nature-based gardening. I also encourage you to use the QR code on the screen to sign up for our newsletter, to stay in touch with our progress. Hopefully in a week or two, we'll have a brand new website for you to look at. We're going to be creating a bunch of resources, modules, worksheets, curriculum. So please stay up to date with what we're doing. And I know there's so many people here who are engaged or want to engage in this kind of work at home or professionally or connectively with folks who are doing this kind of work. So I want to hear from you because I have a ton of stuff to learn as well. And if we can get together and create these kinds of communities and organize these kinds of communities, it was amazing to hear that you all had moved from 300 to 1,400 in a space of 4 years. So good job, Randy. Good work to Cassie's as VP of membership. Good job to all of you. I think this is a growing thing. And even folks like me who love their horticultural plants can come into a space like this. You can see I love my native plants too. So thank you so much. I appreciate you bearing through.
Yeah, we only have time for just a couple questions because
I went on for so long.
Yeah, well, you took a page from my book and talked too long. So let's just take a couple quick questions here.
Nothing. Uh-oh.
What was the name of the garden in England that you mentioned?
Great Dixter, and they have so much work about the biodiversity angle that they're doing. Videos that you can see. The guy who works there, Fergus Garrett, he's actually speaking in the area over the next couple of weeks. He talks so much about that biodiversity work, about the biodiversity survey they did, and why he thinks all the practices that they're using there are so productive of biodiversity. Really interesting, fascinating stuff for any gardener, but especially folks who are trying to support ecological practices and ecology in general. You had a comment, I heard you say.
Yes, I thank you very much for your talk. You did a great job. The one thing I wanted to mention about the two-stroke motors, the leaf blowers, they also cause, in a half hour of use, as much pollution as taking a car and driving it to Chicago.
Yeah.
Because our cars have much more all kinds of controls on it to prevent pollution.
Well, the two-stroke, you have to put in an oil, and when you're burning the fuel, you're also burning that oil, and it's much more productive of damaging pollution. So yeah, there are all kinds of crazy figures about what it takes to run a string trimmer, a backpack blower, whatever, a two-stroke engine. It's like, it's crazy. It's like an F-150 for like 6 months or something versus like an hour. It's crazy. That might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's not much of one.
There are some towns that are banning the two-stroke motors, but when we brought it to Matasquan, our environmental commission didn't want to actually say that we should. They just said, well, you might want to think about it. So it wasn't a strong endorsement, but I think it's something maybe I might follow up on more now.
Helen said that the industry is moving towards battery operated, and that's true, but I still think hand tools are better. If we can manage with our hands, if we can create landscapes that we can manage with our hands, that's probably better off than using any kind of external energy source. I know it's hard for some people.
One more question.
I just have a quick question. You showed a slide of like the allium being the structural part of the garden, and then you have companion plants and ground covers. You said structural was 20%. what's the other 2% for those other kinds of plants?
Okay, so it's been a while since I took that class. It was like 2016 or something like that. But he's coming. I think he's coming back to speak in Manhattan. But it's maybe 10 to 20% companion structural plants, maybe 30% companion plants, and then the rest is ground cover, I think. But you can adjust those as you see fit. But the ground cover is the most important part of that. And you see Larry Weiner talk about that too, and Doug, I'm sure, as well. That's the weed suppressant. That's what keeps you from going in and using herbicides ideally later. That's what keeps you from having to spend all your day weeding. The thicker you can get that ground layer, the less work you have to do, fewer inputs we have. Yep.
We have a Zoom question. Bobby. That was it. That was it. You answered it.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I don't think.
Thank you, sir. So I've discovered that threatening you all you guys with door prizes at the end does actually keep your everybody in their seats. That's wonderful. So just a couple quick slides. I do want to again thank the planning committee for doing a fabulous job and all the volunteers that helped today as well. We had folks keeping the teapot full of hot water, and we had people ushering you to lunch, and we had people putting up signs so you could find the place today, and all kinds of volunteers manning tables and counting and doing everything else, and we couldn't have done it without all our volunteers. So thank you to all the volunteers. I want to thank again to our exhibitors. They're out there. I think they're still set up. You can stop by on your way out. I want to thank all the door prize donators once again. And when I stop talking, I will hand out prizes. I want to thank our generous sponsors, the college here, Barnegat Bay Partnership and Jersey Friendly Yards. Thank you so much for them. We couldn't have been here today without them. Look for the mini grant program launching on the 18th of March. Don't forget that we're always looking for folks to join the team. If you have any special skills, this or other things that you'd like to help us out with, let us know. If you are getting continuing education units, you have to complete your paperwork or it won't work. Make sure you do that. Don't forget to follow us on all your favorite social media platforms, and you can always just go to our website to find out what's going on. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming today. Thank you for everyone joining us on Zoom. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Don't forget to sign up to be a member of MPSNJ.